So how could we implement the fetch mechanism? It's clear that data should be fetched when we visit this coaches page or when we click refresh. So therefore, we want to initiate data fetching when the coaches list component is loaded onto the screen, right? Because that is where we need the coach data. And it's true, we want to initiate it here, but initiate doesn't mean that we have to do the entire send the request and parse the response logic here. Instead, we can still leverage Vuex for that, because there we still manage the coach data once it is in our app locally, and therefore here we could also add an action for fetching data and a mutation for then using that fetched data. And that is a great approach because it allows us to do all the heavy lifting of sending the HTTP request and parsing the response out of a component into Vuex. And that allows us to keep our components lean, which is always good. So therefore, we can add a new mutation in our coaches mutations file and maybe name this mutation set coaches, because I want to set my local coaches in the Vuex state to the coaches we will have fetched from Firebase. So here we get our state and our payload, and we can assume that the payload is a list of coaches, so we can just set our coaches equal to payload. Now the action will be more interesting. Here I want to add a new action, a second action, which is the load coaches action, where we get a context and then also probably a payload. And here we want to send the request to load the coaches from Firebase. And this action will be dispatched from any component that wants to trigger this loading process. So here we want to send a request to the same URL as we used for storing data. So we can copy this part here of the old fetch request and use it here again. We don't need a second argument though, because here I'm fine with a get request. I again want to use async await instead of then and so on. So therefore here we can then just await this and store the response in a new constant. In the next line, we can then get our response data. So response data by awaiting response.json. And once that is parsed, we can again check if the response is maybe not okay, and then do any kind of error handling, which I will again not do here, but which we can implement later. Again, let's assume that everything works though, and therefore now we can almost commit our mutation, but there's one other thing we gotta do first. We need to transform the data we're fetching such that it has the format we need here. Because when we get data from Firebase, we'll get it as one big object, and we rather want to have an array of coaches, not just one big object. And actually there I also noticed one other thing. I don't want to fetch the coaches for just one user ID. Instead, I want to fetch all coaches from the coaches node, so that we fetch all the coaches we eventually have here below coaches. But that will be one big object then, where we have the coach IDs as property names and then nested objects with the coach data. And that's not the format we need here. So we need to transform this first, and for that we can create a helper constant here, coaches, which is an empty array. And then with a for in loop, we can go through our entire response data, which will be this object full of coaches, where we then get each coach ID as a key here. And then simply construct a new coach object here, which has the same format as the coach data we use here when we store a coach. So first name, last name, and so on. Let's just copy that and bring it down there. And now set first name equal to response data for the given key, for the given coach ID, at which we're currently looking at in this iteration, dot first name, accessing the first name property of the nested object for this coach with this ID. Because every coach has this first name property on Firebase. And we repeat this game for the last name. And also here for the description. Here, of course, for the hourly rate. And it's hourly rate here on Firebase as well. And also for the areas. And we now also need to add the ID here, and that's just our key for this iteration, right? Because key will be this ID. That's the main object for which we loop with all these keys, and therefore key will be our coach ID. Yeah, that's looking good. So now we build this coach. We can then reach out to this coaches array, this helper array here, and push this coach into this array. And now we thereafter have an array full of correctly formatted coaches. And therefore now we can commit set coaches and set our coaches here as the coaches we loaded. And I'm getting an error now that I'm not using payload, and that's correct, so let's remove it. Now we have the load coaches action, and we can now dispatch this in coaches list. Here I want to dispatch it when this component loads, and also when the refresh button is clicked. So therefore we can add a new method here, load coaches, and in there reach out to the store, dispatch coaches slash load coaches. Load coaches was the action name defined here. Like that. And load coaches, this method, should now be triggered when this component is created. So therefore, we can add the created lifecycle hook here, the created lifecycle method, which Vue executes when this component is created. And in there, we can point at this load coaches and execute that. And in addition, I want to do it when this button is pressed, so we can bind the refresh button, the click event there, to load coaches, the method we just added. And if we now give this a try and reload, if I load this app, we see the old dummy data briefly, but then we see the coach. And then the register as coach button also goes away. Now, of course, the flickering here is not what we want though. So as a next step, we can work on showing a loading spinner and maybe also ensure that we handle errors in a nicer way.